Good morning, everyone. Let's turn our Bibles to 1 Timothy. Finally, we completed chapter 2, and now, today, we are starting chapter 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. That's what we are looking today. If you're familiar with this passage talks about pastors, or elders, overseers, bishops, all the same name, the same job. However, as you think of a pastor or an elder in a church, I remember as a child, and I used to think, how did he decide, take potlucks, packets, with some cash, and go home, That's how it was. And my mom used to say, no, this God's servant should be, well educated. He should be She focused on my brother in this area. She sent to good colleges. He studied, however, it panned out differently. He's working for government. His pastoral calling is a noble calling, high calling. It has to be given higher importance. You see, Paul says, if anyone aspires the office of an overseer, he desires a noble task. It is a higher calling. However, now you can sit and say, I'm in the pew, I'm not the pastor, so this text doesn't actually talk about me. I don't have to pay attention to it. My dear brothers and sisters, if you see, this is a man after God's own heart. The description that you see in chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, is an ideal, good Christian lifestyle. There is no escape. Church, so that he can bless the church through that person. So I pray that as you go through this passage, I pray that you will be convicted of the areas where you struggle, and I pray that you will go to Christ and transform and become Christ-like. So with that said, we'll go to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 7. I'm reading from ESV version. It reads, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of an overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not lover of money. Verse 4, he must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church, God's household? He by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. May God bless this reading. As you have seen this passage, primarily focusing on the elders, and you see this word in the beginning, verse 1 of chapter 3, he says, if anyone aspires to the office of overseer, and overseer must be above reproach. In some translations, it's called bishop. And we think that, some might think that pastors, bishops, overseers, these are all different roles. Elders are different roles. But you see, in the New Testament, authors of the New Testament used all these words interchangeably for the same role. I remember the word, because bishop is very familiar. If you know J.C. Ryle, bishop, is Anglican church pastor, was a bishop. And this is the idea. In the Anglican churches, they'll have normal priests, normal pastors, and the bishops who are like head of the cities among certain number of churches. And the impression that they usually have is that bishop is the big guy. And in London, I guess, when he's coming to preach, everyone heard bishop is coming today, and everyone attended. And while returning back, one woman commented, is bishop? I could understand everything he said. He can't be bishop. You see, the bishop means somebody high. He shares some higher knowledge, something, something people in the pew can't understand. That's not really what it is. If you look in the Bible, bishop, pastor, elder, overseer, all addressed to one role, the one who shepherds the flock. If you turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17, he says, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Here he uses word elders, you see, not an overseer. In chapter 3 he said overseer, but in chapter 5 he says elders among you. And again he says, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory. Himself used 3 titles. He called elders and he asked them to pastor and oversee. You see, it's the same role, but they use these words interchangeably. Okay, so we are clear on that. There's no separate bishops. There's no separate overseer. There's no separate elders. All belong to one role. Okay. With that said, today we will look into 3 essential qualities of an elder. I know we have read plenty, but I summarize them as 3 essential qualities of an elder. Number 1 comes from verse 1. This word trustworthy is trustworthy, saying that Christ Jesus came into this world to save sinners. Right? That is the first. And in chapter 3 we have seen here. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 11 and Titus chapter 3 verse 8. Chapter 4 verse 9 in 1 Timothy again. Trustworthy, worthy to be trusted, easy to believe. So what is the trustworthy statement that he is making? He says, if anyone aspires to the office of an overseer, he desires noble task. He wants us to understand this. One particular thing from this verse is that you have to understand, if anyone is aspiring this job of an overseer, it is a noble task. You have to understand, it is a noble task. As I earlier mentioned, it is a higher calling. Noble, that literally that word means good, beautiful, honorable, valuable job. He wants us to understand, which talks about this person being a man. And that's why he uses pronoun, he desires a noble task. We have seen chapter 2 towards the end last time also. Paul said, woman cannot exercise authority over man. When she is in a mixed group, she can't exercise authority. She shouldn't be exercising authority. She shouldn't be priest. Everyone, specifically those who desire the overseer or aspire the overseer. If you are not convinced, you can read throughout this passage. You will see from verse 1 and 7, he uses all male pronouns. He. And not just that, where Paul was writing. He's talking about man who loves one woman. Wife has a wife who has only one wife. He must be husband of one wife. And not just that, he also says later part, he must manage his household well. This is completely, but no. I remember I mentioned about the calling, even in the introduction. How can a person discern that he is an elder? He should be in the ministry. Every should, like, if anybody in the church wants to be a pastor or head of the church, or the leader of the church, can he be the pastor just because he is desiring? How should he discern? That's the question that comes into our minds. I remember even from verses 2 to 7, external call. His calling is proved by his external behavior. That's why you see from chapter 2 conference, I used to ask all of the pastors, tell me about your calling, because I wanted to know about my calling. And everyone used to come and say, okay, I was reading Isaiah chapter 6 and I read verse 8. It said, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me. When I read this passage, I was convicted, God is calling me, and I came into the ministry. Everybody answered that. And I was waiting for that. I thought God will call me like that. That will never happen. This is the call of Isaiah. God called Papa. And I went to seminary. I know my friends were good guys who were in the seminary just because Mama told me so. And then now they are not in ministry. Many came out of that excitement in the early days, and many remember, I want to live while playing games. You run in your track to win the race. If you be a faithful, employing your children, taking care of them, leading them in Christ, they have the same crown as Apostle Paul has. If you be faithful like Apostle Paul. It depends upon your faithfulness in the place where you are, not the job. Doesn't matter what job you are in, as long as it honors Christ. He says aspires and desires. I'm not giving English meaning, but original language, this word aspire, it root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. You see that word cravings? That's the word that is used. So he craves for this work. Okay, number 2, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 16. You don't have to turn, I'll read for you. It says, but as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. That desiring a better country. So now you might say, it looks more internal, Daryl. But let me tell you, in both the contexts, it talks about people because of their internal desire and aspiration made changes outwardly. This word actually aspire in original language literally means stretching out, to stretch out. So you're really making practical steps towards it. That's the thing. So if a man aspires the office of an overseer, which means if he is putting steps towards that, to exactly say, I can quote Paul. Remember Acts chapter 17 chapter verse 16, when he enters into Athens, he sees the idols. And it says he was provoked in the spirit when he saw the idols. What is that provocation? When if you are a man, the Greeks and the barbarians, everybody, why? Because he was called to preach to the Gentiles, he fueled that desire. John Piper rightly says, missions exist because worship doesn't. Primarily, he loves people. They are going to hell, and I want to preach the gospel. This is the internal calling. It's the compulsion in their heart. Dear brothers and sisters, irrespective of what ministry, if you say you don't have any other gifts, but you see this area lacking, maybe share that. You see? And coming back to the text, it's very important that we make it clear that this man who desires and aspires, it's not the position you called or to be in. You don't have to worry about the titles. You want to do the work, so you will share. You don't, I remember testimonies like this. I remember one person who was an elderly man who moved to different church after 28 years. And when asked, why did you move? No one appreciated in the church for what I was doing. And I don't want to completely judge him and lay a burden on him. It is church's mistake. When the church's mistake, you can say just thank you for doing the overseeing. They pray for the sick. James 5:14. They design church policy. Remember Acts 15 when there was as I earlier mentioned, he is a man who is looking for labor, the work. And when God looks towards a man or a woman, this is what he looks. A person wants to be servant leader. Remember, Jesus told, Mark 10:45, right? He being the example. From 42 to 45 actually he wants to be the servant. He wants to be servant leader, not the director. You know, if you've been with a group and working together, there will be one person who will not put hands on moving things or doing works, but he will be in the direction department. No, don't put this here. Put the chair there and the table here. Actually, it looks good. Why don't you do it? You know, but we should serve one another. And if you are not serving in the church, then you are actually hurting in the church and yourself. You're not growing actually. You should be part of the church and serving in the church. That's the person who is actually growing the overseer. Number 2, he must have a life without blame. As I earlier mentioned, the calling into the ministry is discerned by this 2 callings. Number 1, internally he understands the calling of God. Number 2, externally it is approved by labor. This is how he should be. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach. You're not going to hear voice from heaven. You will hear voice from the church approving your calling. He says he must be above reproach. And this word above qualities that is mentioned, it's like it's impossible to be sinless. What Paul is talking here is that a person whom you can't hold on him, like you can't arrest him for anything. He has a life that is open for criticism, and you don't find anything to blame on. He's blameless. You can't blame him of certain sin. And he should have this blameless life, a life without blame. And verses 2 and 3, as he says he should be above reproach, first and foremost thing he mentions is that he should be the husband position. Whose heart is devoted to one woman.